Just want to remind you that we are recording. Before we do anything, let's take a minute, take a deep breath, be present, be here. I know a lot of you have been running around and trying to get technology going. Take a minute to remind yourself of why you do the work you do and what got you into it. I think we all care about people in crisis, in various forms of disaster, and want to help people to get them out better. But take a minute to reconnect to why do you do the work you do, and what do you want to accomplish with it? And take a deep breath. So welcome to the second series of roundtables. This is on social ties in grassroots crisis response is the general topic. My name is Suzanne Ewell. I'm the founder and driving force behind Creative Crisis Leadership. We are a nonprofit startup whose mission is to get people to take action in a crisis by giving them motivation, direction, and confidence they need to take action when there's chaos and uncertainty going on around them. And then we want to spread the skills that people need for a group of strangers to pull together and improvise collective action and leadership. So when I was thinking about this session, I can translate that into our goal is to help people learn to activate weak, invisible, and latent social ties and accelerate the development of bonding ties and leverage available bridging and linking ties. That's really what we're all about. Getting those people who are sitting there in a miasma of ties that are not easily activated, walking up to a stranger and saying, hey, we should do something, as we know is not easy. And then getting from there to leadership and a collective group is harder. I have with me Jasmine Chen, who will give herself a brief introduction to her organization, because this effort is a collaborative effort.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmine Chen. I am the co-founder of Re+Connect. It is a social venture. We're building a civic technology solution to close the last mile disaster relief gap and build long-term resilience for underserved communities in places like Puerto Rico, and that's why I moved here. We're building a mobile application that leverages human networks, machine intelligence, and social sciences like we all are studying here to inform and coordinate collective action across residents and community groups and humanitarian aid agencies to direct the right responses to the right places at the right time. And a lot of this is really based on a lot of the principles and discussions that Suzanne was proposing and y'all are studying, and we're collaborating with different researchers, trying to embed a lot of the discussions into the technology that we're building. And right now we are on a National Science Foundation grant and working with a lot of communities on the ground. And so the discussions here is very much relevant to what we're doing. And I'm looking forward to learning with you all. So thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. And I apologize. I've been pronouncing your name wrong all this time. So the purpose of the Roundtable series, this is a new effort for us that we hope will turn into a longer running series. The goal is to bring together researchers in order to promote research around grassroots crisis response. Because as you probably are aware that there aren't many efforts, and the ones there are tend to be isolated, people sitting in different pockets. So we want to promote research in that area, hope to find opportunities for collaboration, cooperation, and quite selfishly make sure that our work, both Re+Collect and Creative Crisis Leadership, that we know what the research is and we're grounding our work in it solidly so we know we can get the results we're aiming for. With that, we're going to do some introductions, and I'm going to go ahead. I collected introductions from everyone almost, and I'm just going to read them to you so we can keep the time bounded. So let's start with, we'll just go alphabetically because that's how I have them listed here. So Charlotte Monte, am I pronouncing that correctly? How do you pronounce your name, Charlotte? Or is it Charlotte?
Yeah, it's Charlotte Monte.
Charlotte Monte.
Yeah.
Charlotte Monte is a social scientist. She specializes in the field of risk and disaster, and for her PhD work, she worked on the role of social networks for post-disaster recovery on the island of Montserrat. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah.
Montserrat in the Caribbean. She is also interested in how memory construction affects risk perception and risk disaster reduction practices, and is at present working on flood disaster management, risk perception, and management of uncertainties. And as we go through these, make a note of people you know who you know, but also people you might, I think I might have heard of this work or of this person. Eric, welcome, Eric. Eric is an assistant professor. Oh, I should have said that Charlotte is a postdoc researcher at, and I should have spelled that, LAGM. What is LAGM at Charlotte?
It means Laboratory of Urban Management and Geography and something like that in French.
Something, right, at the Université de Montpellier in France. And Eric is an assistant professor of social epidemiology at University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston School of Public Health, but is at their El Paso campus. And Eric is trained in cultural anthropology, and in most of his work, he uses social network analysis to study disaster response and recovery. And when we emailed, he told me that he had just completed a large social network analysis from Hurricane Harvey, which I'm interested in hearing about because I did some work in Hurricane Harvey as well. But you and I can catch up on that later. Then we have welcome Michelle Meyer. And am I pronouncing your name correctly? Okay. She's a director and associate professor of the Hazard and Reduction Recovery Center at Texas A&M. And she's an associate professor of urban planning, also at Texas A&M, and her research uses the lens of social capital to understand how relationships between individuals, governmental, and non-governmental organizations generate or reduce disaster risk and recovery, especially for marginalized populations. She researches volunteerism and philanthropy, as well as the use of new technology, such as social media in disaster settings. Often does interdisciplinary work and does a lot of community participation, connecting engineering, construction science, landscape architecture, public administration, public health, and sociology with local organizations, students, and residents. So like most of us, she is a boundary crosser and likes to connect different people. Heather, how do we pronounce your name?
McIlvaine Newsad.
McIlvaine Newsad. All right, thank you. Heather is a professor of anthropology and director of the anthropology program at Western Illinois University, which is in flyover zone in Illinois. We had that conversation, except Michelle knows where it is. And her research focuses on collaborative action for sustainability, and her goal is to understand biological and cultural diversity and the forces that threaten both. Her research explores the conditions under which individuals come together as groups to protect what they value, whether it's a place, a language, a cultural tradition, or a way of life. As an anthropologist, she operates in the public sphere, making the lessons of anthropology accessible and meaningful for all. Heather also writes commentary for her local public radio station, makes teaching videos, and takes groups of students abroad, and considers the purpose of anthropology to make the world safe for diversity. Good, an admirable goal. Zeno Franco didn't send me anything because That's how Zeno is. So I have made something up Zeno because I know Zeno. So Zeno's an associate professor at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He brings a background in clinical psychology, community engagement, and the psychology of crisis response and heroic action to cast light on the relationship between individual action and group behavior. Zeno plays the guitar. He writes faster than a speeding bullet. The rate at which this man churns out words is astonishing. I've watched him in action. And in his youth, helped his father haul cow carcasses out for endangered condors in California.
That about sums it up. The cow carcasses are especially fun stories.
Yeah. Jasmine Chen has an academic and professional experience in environmental management community. She's the co-founder and director of Replus Collective. Has a background in environmental management, community development, disaster resilience, and digital development, and is interested in how we can overcome institutional cultural barriers between disaster management agencies and community groups, both at organizational and individual levels. And my name is Suzanne Ewell. I am the founder and driving force of Creative Crisis Leadership. I have a rich and varied background. My first career was in theater, eventually went into software engineering, then into user experience research and design. Discovered a passion for disaster management after 9/11, and 20 years later, did some research, have done research in some aspects of disaster, but have gotten interest in this question of my experience has been the people who come out best are the ones who help themselves. And that is a much neglected area in our whole preparedness and response system. So what I'd like to do now is go around. We have prepared a Moreau board and go around, and I'd like to hear who knows whom. And we have the link we can share. Oh, here, I can share it in the chat, and you can help edit the board, copy board link, chat. Or Jasmine will also help to drive. So if we start with Eric, who let's
you want me
share
to respond verbally?
Yeah, tell us
Okay.
tell us who you actually know, and you can help edit the board if you want, or just get in there. I don't know if is everyone in it? I won't have to share my screen. So what's your relationships here?
So I published in the book on networks and disasters, Michelle, and have published a paper with contributed network stuff to the paper by Casagrande and McIlvaine-Newsted. And Heather and I know each other probably through Dave, before publishing together and at conferences, being anthropologists. And I think I've published her as well in the Journal of Ecological Anthropology on some garden work, the sustainability stuff that she works on.
Okay.
That's it.
And have you heard of anyone else before this event?
Louise, of course, is a leader in the field, and tried to get her into the book, but was too busy at the time, or didn't feel like she had, something particular to contribute. So that was, I think, it as far as my knowledge of folks.
Okay. And moving on, Heather.
Exactly what Eric said. But I think I might have a connection, and sorry for my puppies. I have like the Matrix trio back here, Neo, Trinity, and Morpheus, and they're a little bit off their rocker right now. But I think I may have some connections with Jasmine, because I've been working in Puerto Rico for the last 5 years with a former student, and was working there before Maria hit, and then continued to work again with community gardens, and looking at the way the community gardens were serving as also a political and economic way in which people were organizing themselves after Maria. And we're continuing that work. And I've been working with Laura Gabaray, who is an anthropologist who is also in Puerto Rico, who Jasmine, you might know. She works in educational anthropology.
Okay. Thank you. And Charlotte.
So it's a lot more limited. I just know by name Michel Meyer because I used a lot your work during my PhD to understand social capital and these kind of things. So that's that's all.
Oops. Okay. Let me get that. All right, and Zeno.
You're the only point of connection here, Suzanne. So for me, I think.
Okay.
It was great to meet everybody.
So this is serving our purpose here of, oops. I'm going to remove that one because we have someone guest painter who's blocking my view of, well, here I can do this. There, that's me. Okay. One there. And Michelle?
Yeah, I have a chapter in Eric's book. And then I know Louise Comfort. I've met her in person. So that's a real life connection, although I haven't worked with her before.
Okay. I'll make that one solid. And you got Louise there. And Jasmine?
So I work with Daniel Aldrich quite a bit on our work, so I've definitely heard of Michelle and read your paper. And yeah, and Susanna and I, we've been working together for more than half a year now. And yeah, I think that's it.
Let's change that. And there. And I know Zeno has, know Zeno, I know Jasmine. I've certainly talked to Louise and Zheng Wan. Actually, you've heard, Zheng Wan too, Jasmine. And I've read Michelle's paper. I had read Michelle's paper before this roundtable, and everyone else I had not heard of before the roundtable, but I have now read your papers. And they are great papers. So thank you. So strengthening networks. Thank you all. Good to know how you know each other and see what the connections are. So let's get our discussion started. Our format is, it's a pretty much an open discussion. I have asked Michelle to give us some kickoff here. The ground rules are obviously courtesy manners. I don't have to worry about that. If anyone starts going on for too long, we reserve the right to, as a group, to override you and take back the topic, take back the conversation. I'm going to drop some definitions in the chat around social ties. It's just loose, pulled from actually most of your papers, so that anyone who has not looked at them recently isn't sitting there, has an idea of, oh yeah, I remember what bonding ties are, what the distinctions are. And I'll drop them in a minute. Jasmine's going to be taking notes. We are recording. And I think that's it. Otherwise, it's just an open conversation. The plan is we will go until whatever 50, and then do a round of wrap up takeaways, and then can continue with informal discussion for anyone who wants to stay after that. So any questions before we get going here? All right, so the general topic is, how do different types of social ties affect grassroots crisis response, emergence, and success, with a bunch of possible sub-questions. And Michelle has graciously agreed to help kick us off with her perspective. So over to you, Michelle.
Yeah, so I think I wanted to open I often do qualitative interviews, and I often open with asking the participant with a story. And then from there, we dig into more information. So I'm going to pitch out if folks would like to share a story from their research or from, events that they've worked in that kind of exemplifies for them the way that social ties really can support disaster resilience, and that they might grow or emerge post-disaster from a community. So I'll give my example of one that I think did a great job. So a community here in Texas was affected, a small rural community affected by a wildfire. And they didn't have a Red Cross, they didn't have any other kind of disaster management organizations in their community. And they were trying to figure out, well, what do we do? And where they started was the emergency manager knew that there was a breakfast club of nonprofits. So the local county judge had several years before started having monthly breakfasts where community leaders and nonprofits in the community would meet each month and talk about whatever was going on in the community. It wasn't anything disaster related in any way. And then when the wildfires happened, that's where the emergency manager went to say, okay, I need your all's help. What do we do? And so from there, they built out their long-term recovery team, long-term recovery committee, decided who was going to do what, how they were going to deal with getting donations, sheltering, those types of things. So they were able to take that regular community social ties and networks and really transform them when they needed to in a disaster and kind of sped up that process post-disaster. So that's one of my favorite stories from research, and one I often tell when I'm in new communities about how they can use their current social ties in a disaster setting. So I don't know if others had a favorite story that they wanted to kick off with that kind of exemplifies for them.
Well, I guess I can jump in here. For the last, has it been 15, 16 months of COVID, I've been doing ethnographic research in my community with a group of people who originally came together because we're all returned Peace Corps volunteers. So our point of connection is the university in some sort. We're either professors or returned volunteers married to professors, and we saw the need to be able to initially deliver food to people when the lockdown started. And because we have a Return Peace Corps Fellow Master's program, we then enlisted the master's students to do this as well. And we formed an emergency response program that in the last 18 months has raised $500,000, which is significant for this part of rural Illinois. We've delivered over 350,000 home deliveries of food. So it's about 500 deliveries a week. And last summer, we were in charge of distributing summer meals to children who were school-aged children. We also set off what we've called Kids Cook program, so where we're actually teaching children how to cook. So we delivered food and equipment to their households, and then we had volunteers make videos. And so it's kind of like Food Network, but just for Forgotonia, right? And then we actually have victory gardens. So this year, last year we had 3 victory gardens that are open to anybody in the community. And this year we have 5 of them. And the ties that really started it, and I'm looking at these definitions of strength of ties, and none of them really fit because we all come from different places. But I think the thing that originally connected us was that that mission that Peace Corps instills in volunteers, that then they ask you to, and I'm a returned volunteer from the Dominican Republic a gazillion years ago, that they ask you to give back to your own community. And so each of those individuals in this in this organization was then able to leverage the social ties that they have, be they political or economic. It's been really interesting. I'm working on a paper on it now, and having a medical anthropologist friend of mine do the social network analysis. And really, I think the story is not so much about the work that's been done, but the changing political organizations in the community. Because as in lots of parts of rural America, this is a very conservative community. It's an agricultural based community. And the people who are in political power have been in power for decades and decades. And we're starting to see that change. And it's really messy and it's really interesting. So stay tuned.
Thank you. And we'll get back, let's get back to that point, because I thought you started raising an interesting point about what are the ties in those stories. But I want to welcome Louise.
And sorry, I've been on Zoom since 6 a.m. and was in another meeting that ran over. So I'm sorry to be late, and glad to see you all and join you.
We understand. One of the things we discovered was we did a little exercise to see who had talked to whom before this, and who had sort of knew of each other. And your name came up as well, Louise. Of course, we all have at least heard of her. If we don't actually know her. So welcome. So I'm not going to give a long introduction. Just Louise is a professor and former director of Center Disaster Management, Graduate School of Public Information, International Affairs at University of Pittsburgh. And she is also affiliated faculty with the Policy Lab at the Center for Information Technology and Research in the Interest of Society at UC Berkeley, and concurrently a professor at the School of Government in Nanjing University. And I happen to know that Louise is currently over in Oakland.
Yes.
So welcome, Louise.
I'm home. So Oakland,
excellent. Yeah.
Right.
So with that, let's go back to where you were headed, Heather, Michelle. Other comments on those stories? On what were the connections you heard about in there? Does anyone have comments on the stories that Heather and Michelle brought up?
Just that it feels a lot of the time like these stories are one-offs, that, you know, looking for patterns in the way that people come together is really challenging, and the ways that networks end up supporting, you know, response, recovery, adaptation, future mitigation, feels contextual a lot of the time. It's what I've seen in my work, and so I'm still trying to figure out, you know, how to find those things that can be drawn upon without you know, an insane amount of effort and resources to bring people together.
I think also I reflect from the stories you said and my work in Montserrat in the Caribbean, where social ties were totally disrupted during the crisis because most of the population left, and the population went down from 12,000 people to about 2,000 people at some point of the crisis. And then the population grew up again with immigration from other islands. So all the society changed very rapidly. And what happened was, during the crisis, there was a lot of connection between people, the people who remained on the island, to help each other. But now on the longer term, that kind of support is maybe having a different type of effect, and maybe not so positive on the long term. because it is like a very strong connection between the Montserratian who stayed on the island, but without new connection with the new immigrant. So it's like the connection couldn't move along with the crisis and the recovery process. That there wasn't that shift, and I feel it's very important to focus on what are the effects of those connections at what time. So at the moment of the crisis, it may be very important. It may really help the relieve the emergency process, but on the long term, it can have the totally opposite effect if it doesn't integrate the whole society and we don't shift from a very bonding the connection to more bridging that bridge or that link all the different communities, and even those who were not there during the crisis.
That's very interesting, and I'm sorry I missed the presentations, but your comments, Charlotte, ring very resonate with me in terms of how Oakland recovered after the 91 fire. And I am back in Oakland. I lost my home in the fire. And I would say half of the residents of this neighborhood left. The whole process of rebuilding was more than they could manage. They didn't want to deal with it. And consequently, new families came in. And the surprise was, given the rate of rebuilding, the new families sort of trickled in one at a time, two at a time on the different streets in the neighborhoods. And there were maybe half is too many, but a good third of the residents in the neighborhoods had survived the fire and stayed. And so they provided a nucleus to welcome and educate the new people coming in, and consequently new groups within the community did form and were, these are the neighborhood groups that were very much interested in wildfire. And one of the interesting things is the threat of wildfire remains. So the residents of the community sort of gathered the new people coming in and say, this is a major area. This is, a lovely neighborhood. We welcome you, but we also have this continuing threat of wildfire. So it may have something to do with the nucleus of people that are there and the speed with which new people re-enter. I will say, I think most of the new people in the neighborhood have easily and readily joined these wildfire or neighborhood groups, community organization groups.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're just kind of jumping around and kind of reflecting on different stuff. So I'll just say for myself, at the outset of the COVID-19 crisis, we were heavily involved here at the Medical College of Wisconsin trying to get improvised masks out to the community with a strong emphasis on equity and making sure that communities of color who were being differentially impacted were receiving those improvised masks. So for us, one of the big things was that we were actually working with manufacturing businesses in the region who had melt-blown polypropylene on hand, which is the same surgical material, surgical mask material that's used in sort of traditional masks in the hospital, but we couldn't use those masks because they were all being reserved, of course, for first responders and hospital staff. But there were a number of businesses that had the material in kind of a more rudimentary form available. And that particular material has some, it's electrostatically charged, so it is able to filter out small particles just because of the manufacturing process that it goes through. So it's kind of just an interesting situation for us. We had a lot of sort of role reversals during the process. where we were ended up relying on community partners who often rely on us for things. We didn't have, for example, a fleet of trucks to go pick up raw material that needed to be assembled into these improvised masks. And so we actually had to call community partners who had, you know, the F-150s and send them up about 30 or 40 miles north of us to pick up raw materials. So just some kind of interesting pieces. We just pushed that out into a Instagram paper for those folks that are part of that community, and there's a couple of us here. So, you know, I think that was one piece. I think another piece that we've really been working on, we got a rapid response grant from a major endowment here in Wisconsin to really focus on tailoring public health messaging for minority communities and trying to really get that, you know, basic information about infection control, social distancing, you know, how to manage during the sort of acute months of the crisis, out to communities that just weren't hearing the primary messages on sort of traditional media. So we're really, I think, focused on community engagement strategies to reach the hard to reach during this crisis. And we've also used community health worker model as well as kind of local influencer models within minority communities to do some of that work. So just kind of give you an overview of where we've been in the last year or so with some of this stuff.
I'll offer a story. We study a very tragic daycare fire that occurred in 2009 in northern Mexico, in Hermosillo. And there were 50 children, 49 children who died, and roughly the other 100 were injured in some way or amount. And the people, the parents and caregivers, you know, aunties, uncles, grandparents, in some cases, older siblings, but for the, so not everybody was parents, but gave care to the kids, you know, sort of each day were in our sample. These people have kept up the fire, you know, with the national government for years now, for, you know, over 10 years. And they've made some, you know, major progress in some ways nationally, a national law regarding some of the, you know, safety protocols for buildings, and, you know, got the state governor kicked out of office. Now, was it the state governor's, you know, responsibility or problem? Maybe yes, maybe no, but politically, as a group of people, have had quite an impact on the state and the nation. But it also has a little bit of a flip side, because, and we're still trying to figure out the directionality here, but the people who are more involved are hurting worse. The people who are more politically involved in this process are dealing with more post-traumatic stress and depression. And, you know, the question is, does that continued involvement keep them in this space that is challenging to become well, or are they active because they have to be, because this is the only way they can, you know, hang on?
That's a really interesting question. And I think you see how different people react differently. You know, the parents of the Parkland, you know, the kids who were shot at the Parkland school in Florida have taken very different directions. And maybe you saw the really moving, essentially scenario that some of the parents had put together when they held a graduation for the lost class of 2021 and invited the president and vice president of the NRA, or not, it's a gun rights legislation, to come and address the lost class of 2021. And I thought that was a marvelous example of creating a visual image that was shown on national TV for people to look at the consequences of gun violence and what it did to communities and their community in particular. And speaking to the parents afterwards, they said, this is what we can do to commemorate our kids.
Yeah, sorry, Michelle, you're gonna.
Yeah, I was just gonna chime in on those comments that brings up this really complicated aspect of social ties, that they're good, and then there's also negative consequences with them too. And when we measure them, we often want to put them as either, all good, right? then that's great. But at the same time, that there could be those negative consequences. There was an interesting paper, I think by Rick Weil from LSU after Katrina, that like the most socially connected people did have a little more depression because they were getting everybody's sadness and like dealing with everybody all the time post Katrina. But they also overall were more resilient. They recovered quickly because they had all those social ties, but they also felt kind of a burden of those social ties and helping their family and friends get through disasters. So it's this, I think our social ties are so incredibly complicated. And then when we want to measure them in disaster, we have to break them down into something very, very flat, or, not a very multidimensional understanding of how they operate.
And I think what I hear from this is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we're kind of touching on grief, right? And grief in lots of different forms. And we all know that people grieve very differently. There's generational differences in grief. There are cultural differences in grief. And so I think that's really interesting, because that's not something, at least in my part of the world, that people very openly talk about because of the cultural background of people. Where I live, we're Scotch German, so you like drink your grief away, right? You self-medicate. And so this whole notion which I think has been very interesting as a result of COVID, of people actually not being embarrassed to seek out mental health counseling in whatever form it takes, whether it's through mindful meditation or yoga practices or seeing a talk therapist or being on medication. I think that's a really interesting kind of variable as well. And going back to what Eric and Luis and Michelle were saying too, it takes a tremendous amount of effort. I mean, I can't imagine a decade worth of fighting politically, and the emotional and physical toll that takes on people who lost children in a daycare fire, and the kinds of relationships and how that changes those relationships, and then how do you go about measuring them? So it's the really interesting questions and comments.
I guess also it's what we are talking about, because when we say crisis response, yeah, there is a grief, so that's really what's happening right after the disaster. But then what are really the objective? Are we talking about, the fact that people can grieve and be fine psychologically, or can they be, again, in terms of resilience, aware of the risk, because the risk is still may persist. So for instance, in Montserrat, there was still a risk of eruption and volcanic disaster. So is it part of the response also, make people being able to know about all of that and to prepare, and therefore to stimulate their social ties as well, to be prepared on the much more long term? Are we also talking about just rebuilding, which is also different So I guess our post-disaster part is, there is so many aspects of it, so that we have to be really aware of what are the objectives and what we stimulate different social ties for. I don't know if that's clear.
I will have to say that one of the, it was probably honestly the second international disaster that I participated in. And there was a really marvelous psychiatrist named Bruno Lima who worked with me. I followed him to some of the villages high in the Andes that had been absolutely devastated by this disaster. And what he was looking at was the difference between these Indian communities that literally lost everything and they didn't have much to lose in the first place, and the people in the cities in Lima who had access to many more resources and many more people. But the key thing he said that the people needed in both the urban environments and the local environments was information. If you can give people information about next steps, sometimes it's the next thing you have to do, where to get water, how to get clean water, then how to rebuild your house. And in the villages, people built houses out of sun-dried mud, right? Quito, they're building them out of bricks. But the key issue was really to give people, to recognize the types of information that people need in the different stages of disaster and being able to transmit that information to them. And then the ties, do come.
So I think, again, I'm trying to clearly say I'm not necessarily responding to what a person has said. That doesn't mean I'm not reflecting on it and thinking about it, right? So I'm kind of jumping around to different topics and sort of processing what people are saying as we go as well. I think one of the things for me personally that was interesting about this is, I've been doing research in crisis and crisis informatics for a long time. I've been postdoc trained in community engagement, have been working in community engagement for, 12 years since postdoc. And also have, the primary degrees in clinical psych and all these different pieces, right? And so that's all fine. But, in some way, I've never been a crisis responder, right? And that all changed this year in a pretty dramatic way, very quickly. And, I feel like there were several situations where I saw the institution or individuals getting stuck and not able to respond quickly or appropriately. And I don't mean that as a critique. It's just that maybe they didn't have the insight about how to manage through this. And I feel like, there's days when you're sitting here thinking like, oh, I'm just sitting behind a computer working on this stuff. But, in the application, I really felt like having a strong theoretical understanding of some of this stuff is what got me unstuck or got teams unstuck in certain situations. Like we had a set of student delivery drivers who were basically trying to get stuff out into the community. And, we noticed that there was all of a sudden a huge drop off in their delivery rate. And, part of it was that their instruction sets were too complex. And so we just, I went back and I wrote an email that said, if, under these conditions, do X, and under these conditions, do X or do Y, right? And really trying to simplify kind of their approach to field-based decision-making. And that got them unstuck, right? And I think it's been an interesting process going from sort of working in the theoretical or research aspects of this work to then this very serious application of it. And I think sometimes we kind of denigrate the theory and the research in a way, right? But that was actually really, really helpful to have in your back pocket to coach these teams to get through.
I think
Absolutely.
that's true. Yeah, I think that's really true. And this is one of the things that we do learn from theory is that in a crisis, people's problem solving capacity drops and they can only absorb so much information at a time. And so parceling out that information, if you're in a position to give direction, I think is really critical. And what is interesting to me is once you do, and then people take the actions that are effective, they gain confidence in taking the next difficult step. And so a large part of it, I think, is building the confidence and for people that they can act in an absolutely devastated situation.
This is all music to my ears. I just want to build a little bit, and we're going to do a quick round of wrap up, but we can continue discussing. I know Eric has to drop off. I mentored under the Red Cross's top technology manager in Hurricane Katrina as deputy manager for the response in Louisiana. And what he told me one day, he said, well, the thing that makes me so good is I'm always thinking 3 steps ahead. You know, what's the next 3 steps? Because most people only think about the next step, but you have to look ahead to 3. And I looked at him and I thought, okay, my problem is I'm thinking 1,000 steps ahead, and I had to learn only 3 steps. Because by the time you get to step 2, step 3 has changed. So,
Right.
you know, it's that focus, and for coming from a theoretical background, limiting what I did, but having that theoretical understanding of what was going on. But there are a lot of people who have that intuitively. The really good managers have that. I like to go around, do a quick round of just check-ins and what's your takeaway right now, so we can let Eric drop off, and we're welcome to continue the discussion. But I do know that Eric has to go. So do you want to, I'd like to go around and just give me your 1 sentence. What's your thinking right now, your takeaway for at the moment? Eric, would you like to kick us off, get us started?
Yeah, I really am even more intrigued about how to understand and capture latent ties, so the deep structure of a network and what its potential is for activation, you know, for any given network, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Michelle.
Yeah, I agree with Eric, but I'll give something different. This discussion has me thinking, and COVID recently has me thinking about the different resources that we get from social ties and how to parse those out, from, you know, financial to evacuation to labor support during disaster, but now with COVID to mental health support and, you know, friendship and grief support. And how do we measure all those different ways that our social ties really support us?
Thank you. Heather?
I think now the theme that's sticking out in my head is perspective. So, which is very difficult in a disaster situation, I think, to take, but it brought me back to remembering my first encounter with Tony Oliver Smith when I was a brand new student at the University of Florida. And so he's got this group of dissertation students in front of him, PhD students in front of him, and he says, don't forget to get your head out of the foxhole every once in a while and take a long view of things. And I think that is something that ties back to what Zeno was saying about theory. And when you have that in your back pocket, and you know that there will be an end in sight, but you also know that all of the variables that are in step 2 and step 3 will probably change, it gives you a moment, or at least it gives me a moment, to recognize that for right now, I'm okay. And I have the ability in this particular moment to pick my head up and look for the long view come back down and try to figure out how to communicate that in the most appropriate manner to those individuals who perhaps don't have the ability to stick their head out and see what's going on. So that's kind of what I'm taking away right now.
Thank you. It's good. Charlotte? Charlotte, are you there? Did we lose you?
Muted. She's muted.
Yeah, there you go.
Sorry. Yeah, I was trying to. Yes, I guess what I found very interesting is the fact of helping people going over the emotional aspect of the grief and the traumatic aspect of the disaster and the crisis, and being able to start looking for the next step. While the emotional aspect is so strong for some of them, it may be very hard to look for resources and for the next steps. And I guess that's what's very important in disaster and crisis management, to manage all of that, the psychological aspect, but also the very practical aspect of the disaster or the crisis.
Yeah, bringing that emotional dimension is interesting. Louise?
Well, I think I will build on that. To me, the most important thing for building networks in disaster is empathy, and empathy on both sides. And if people understand and know, and it's almost something that's conveyed non-verbally, but if they feel you're listening and if you're welcoming, then they can pick up, muster the strength that they have to go forward. So you can't really give instructions on how to develop empathy, but it really is the capacity to listen and to hear that other person, to recognize that other person, and to make them feel that their contribution is valued. And that gives them hope. And once you have empathy and hope, you can usually mobilize people into an active stage. So I'd go.
Jasmine? Empathy. Yep, empathy is.
Oh, wow. Okay. So this is a lot of like linking to what we're doing here in Puerto Rico. And yeah, I mean, in places like Puerto Rico where the government and the colonial complexities, it's really the communities and their relationships with their neighbors and friends. And we got this Natural Hazard Center grant where we're trying to do to understand informal shelter building, and we did this long story, but some of we asked people to tell us their most trusted sources of information, and actually the number one thing that came back to us are acquaintances and neighbors and families and friends, like more than social media or news or TV or radio or anything like that. And so yeah, that's why we're really trying hard to understand how might we be able to activate that in the face of constant disaster threat in places like Puerto Rico, and the government is still slow, and it's really the communities. We need to give them the resources and emotional and other type of support for each other to get through going forward. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think what I was caught on earlier was Eric's comment that the patterns seem to be contextual of how do response efforts get started, and my intuitive observation and anecdotal evidence is there is always some seed, some nucleus, an individual, an organization, a group that takes the initiative and gets started and starts activating whatever their ties are, whether it's an individual that's activating invisible ties, or starting with a strongly bonded small group starts activating, but there's always that nucleus pattern. And then how that changes, I think Charlotte was talking about, and Michelle was talking about, it gets very complex, and as time goes on and we get into the response, the recovery, how the implications of those social ties change, and that we can start getting into negative consequences. So it was sort of, for me, it was that change that, that what the difference between initiation and active and maintenance, and then, continuing, how that whole thing changes.
Yeah, it's thinking about it as the process, right? We often measure things in research in a snapshot view. What are your social ties at this moment? But social ties in and of themselves are such a process, just like the disaster response and recovery is such a process, and they're going to ebb and flow and change, and the resources through them are going to change, and ties are going to come and go with their importance. And it's fascinating to try to figure out how to research that and study it so that we can find those points in it where we can increase resilience at those different places.
Zeno, I'm interested in your comments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's lots to say here. I think, one of the things that comes to mind for me is sort of developing community leadership during a crisis event. So we worked with community health workers, or in some senses, I think it's a misnomer. And so, thinking about the term community health leader, these are folks that are paraprofessionals, in a sense, at most. So we were working with African American, Hispanic, Southeast Asian, and Native American community health folks, drawn from the neighborhoods in a very complex urban environment here in Milwaukee. And I think, all of them started out worried that they didn't know what they were doing, in both in terms of community. For some of them, this is the first time they've been asked to serve in a more formal community health worker role. For some of them, it was an understood role. But for none of them, was sort of disaster or crisis response part of something that they had done before. And they had, we selected them because they brought, kind of to Suzanne's point, there was a nucleus of activity already happening around what they were doing. So they already brought an incredible amount to the table. But I think they were genuinely worried that they didn't understand the domain well enough to be good, solid contributors. And we're dealing with language barriers in certain cases, cultural differences, et cetera, et cetera. For me, I think at the end of the day, in a sense, my biggest role was offering assurance, and to your point, Louise, trying to build their confidence that they could act and they could continue to act, and that they didn't need the medical college or the city Department of Public Health or the County Office of African American Affairs or any of the institutional partners to tell them what to do, right? In a sense, what we were trying to do is to set them free, to provide them with a minimal infrastructure financially, or in terms of assets that they needed, but to really set them free to set the agenda of response and for the institutions to then follow them. So, I think at the end of a year, and we're just coming to the conclusion of this project, each of them as individuals are in a much different place than where they started. So that's been just an interesting progression to watch in terms of individual development.
Can I ask a question? So I've spent a lot of time in Puerto Rico, and one of I think the most successful programs, community programs I've seen there's a community health promoter program in Butualo in the center of the island, and they are not just community health workers, they're the confidant, right? People wait for them to come and talk to them, and the kind of support that they are able to provide is none of the big humanitarian aid agencies or government, whatever they could provide. However, the big issues that a lot of the health workers that I spend time with, they're like, the pay is so low, like I'd rather go somewhere else if I could. And then on the other part, and we've been doing collaborative design workshops with community leaders and all that, is that they feel like they call the protagonism, like the agencies, they want to be seen as the hero, and that they have all the resources and funding and money, and they'd rather be the person to be delivering whatever is coming from their donor. And it takes a long time, and communities are waiting for things to come, but it doesn't come because they want to deliver on their own, but they don't really have the resources and staff and funding to be going through with 78 municipalities and all the households and the grandmas in the mountains. So
Yep.
So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on how to,
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all probably interested in equity in this discussion. And so I think one of the things that we were able to do, in part because we were well funded, is to really say from the outset that we were going to ensure a reasonable wage for the community health workers at every turn. So for the community health leaders, we had 4 folks sort of managing, we were paying them each $25 an hour. And for the folks that they were managing, we were paying $20 an hour throughout the pandemic. And in some senses, it actually was a jobs program, if you want to think about that, during the sort of the most intense aspects of the crisis, when people were just, the bottom was coming out in terms of the economic situation. So that's one piece. And I think you're absolutely right that a lot of the agencies want to be seen as the heroes. And so we were very deliberate at the conclusion of the program to actually nominate the community health leaders for major awards in the community, so that they would receive the recognition for the work rather than the agencies that they were working for, in some sense. I think another point that you bring up, which is really important, is that some of the major agencies really don't have the capacity to go door to door, right? And that's what it took during COVID, right? Just to deliver food. I mean, there's situation after situation where we needed to get food to a family who's, COVID positive, and we're going to struggle to shelter in place without food delivered to the door, also undocumented, and didn't want to take food from the city. And the city didn't have the resources to move the food to that location. And it took a lot of, humility for the city to just say, we can't do this on our own. Like, we actually need the community health workers to be the eyes and ears, and to move physical assets or relief assets, because we're not trusted in some of these communities. And I think that's also a real huge difference agency by agency, right? The city of Milwaukee basically just said, they threw up, in a positive sense, they threw up their hands and said, we're struggling, we're losing staff, things are really complicated, we don't have a plan. And you work with other agencies, and they try to put a really nice gloss on it, and in reality they're struggling just as much. But because they're not willing to say that they're struggling, it's impossible to actually marry the community health workers to them to help, right? So I think agency humility is a huge consideration in this.
That's really interesting, because we see the same thing here in California with the wildfires. CAL FIRE, which is the primary statewide agency, after the fire siege last year, said, we can't manage it alone. Mm-hmm. So they are reaching out to anyone and everyone to get them to help. And when they do that, some very interesting things that are happening. And one of the most interesting to me is the University of California, all 10 campuses with all of its faculty and all of its students, has made wildfire a major priority. And, professors are teaching students in their classes. University is freeing faculty to work on research. And there's this statewide, not single campuses, but statewide effort to pull the interdisciplinary resources together to address this statewide problem of wildfire. Yeah. And of course, it's not just California, it's all the Western states.
For sure. Well, as a graduate of the University of California system, I'm very pleased to hear that. So maybe one day I can come back and teach in one of those programs. We'll see.
Which campus,
I graduated at the University of California, Riverside for undergrad. So
Well, absolutely in wildfire country.
yeah, absolutely. No, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I think, insight. I mean, I think there are real questions about how the institutions and agencies should position in the space. I mean, where I am, I don't want to take too much time with this, but the medical college where I work, I think, I think one of their strengths is that they will admit that they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Right.
Horrible.
And like, not in a bad way, but like, what, kind of just like, we're not sure what to do with this diversity stuff. We know it's important. And people sometimes misinterpret that as like a lack of interest, but I think it's institutionally, they're just saying like, we don't know, and I think we really have to talk about, the political pressure that agencies are under, when you're seeing stuff go up to the mayor's office here, and what reactions some of these things that seem like they should be no-brainers, but there's just so much political pressure to do something that's more traditional or more, by the book. But that's not oftentimes what's going to work in terms of response.
I think I want to jump in here and point out, Michelle's been talking about the complexity of social ties. And I recall from someone's paper, I don't know if it was Heather and Eric's or Charlotte, talking about the different levels of social ties, that we're talking about social ties at the individual level or at the group or the institutional level. And that layer of complexity, then I can hear the conversation moving between those levels. I just wanted to point that out as an observation here.
I think that's true. I think that's true, Suzanne. And I do think that the richest networks are the ones that include multiple levels. And building those levels, I think can be, I will say guided, not directed.
I think it's interesting because what I hear, Zeno and Jasmine saying is that you have identified people who are real leaders, right? Who are very charismatic leaders. And we know from the research that in order for a community or a place or an institution to come out more resilient on the other side of any type of disaster, you have to have that type of leadership. But it doesn't happen very often, right? Where people can say, I don't know, help me. In Puerto Rico, right, the government is, we know what we're doing, right? And it's not that much different where I live. And so I think the thing that I'm observing right now is that we're really having a bit of an invisible power struggle, because we're seeing a generational shift in power, political and economic, as well as the economy changes. You have a group of people who, like Zeno were saying, we're very interested in social equity. And so we're interested in the changing landscape of rural America. We have undocumented workers who are becoming more and more important economically and politically and culturally. And so like being in the middle of it and watching these kind of power struggles, and it's really, really interesting to see. But I'm also not quite sure how to get to the other side being whole, right, as a community, and not letting those powers that have been in control for so very long continue to maintain the social inequity in terms of access to resources. So any tips you all might have or observations would be awesome.
And I wanted to add to that, in Puerto Rico, the other challenge is right now, a lot of the community leaders, they're actually the older generation. And that when a lot of young people, they are not, and also they're not, a lot of time not getting paid, and they have to get that resources from somewhere else, and that they also have certain way of doing things that often have gone into conflict with the younger people who even have any interest going into it. And then so there's like usually one person who's in control of everything. If anything happens to that person or any of the documentation that they have, it's very, very fragile system. And so, yeah, that kind of power struggle of like also like the youth, how do we support them, and kind of like what you all talk about of giving that sense of confidence and assurance. Yes, you know, yes, you can be part of this. Like in Puerto Rico, it's so needed for that to be more sustainable and spread further.
I think one thing is that the fact that so it's all those relationship and power relationships, they exist long before the disaster. Generally, they are not something totally new. So if we start managing the crisis just after the crisis or during the crisis and ignoring all those relationships, it's very difficult to make people who were not heard or people who were at the very bottom of the hierarchical scale emerge and being strong. And it's something that maybe can be prepared long before. If you know that there is something, a risk, for instance, like where there is a risk of volcanic disaster or flood or whatever or something, you can know that afterwards you will have to respond in this kind of power context, power type of relationship. So it's something to anticipate, because here I see in France, where I work at the moment, is a small city where there is a big gypsy community, and gypsy are very marginalized, and they are not part of the system, of the national system. And even the worker, even though they would want to have empathy or whatever, it's just a so different social system that it just won't work. So one way to prepare for the disaster and then to respond better is to anticipate that after the crisis, if the disaster happens, after you will have to respond with that particular social group with whom you will have to have very different type of answer, and the normal answer won't work. So it's anticipating those power and political relationship between groups.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because I think Heather and Eric, in your paper, you talk about how the existing power structures and social ties often get suspended in the immediate aftermath. So there's this brief moment in time where everything has changed because of the crisis, but then it goes back that, it doesn't go away. So that's yet another dimension on making the complexity of studying social ties, because you have them changing in the event, but it's all happening in the context of the existing power dynamics. And as I think Heather pointed out, and Zeno has seen this, is how in, when there is a greater social shift, that like what we're seeing now, it's all happening in this bigger crisis changing disruptive structure.
And I just want to throw in, a variable that we haven't been talking about necessarily, but at least, so this project that I've been working on for the last 18 months, gender is a huge variable, right? So it's the women who are out there on the forefront, and they are not the political leaders. They are not the people who have the economic assets. It's still very much, this part of the world is still very much a white, patriarchal, very conservative way of analyzing things, so and running things. And that goes back to the paper that Eric and I wrote, is whether we're talking about farmers or politicians, they are the people that still have those very powerful ties, right? They have the access to the people in the Senate and the access to all of that. And it's really, really fascinating how changes at a larger level, like just the political climate of Illinois, whether it's Democrat or Republican, filters down everything, right? But the people who are really doing all of the work, or the majority of the work, are 51% of the population, and they're women. And there's, they may get a little shout out here or there, but they're not having nearly the recognition that they deserve for making these, what I think are larger social changes that we will hopefully see the benefits from in 20, 30 years from now.
Yeah, I think that's so, yeah, no, that's an excellent point about the gender. And I see that here, in Texas, that's the same thing, that we have going on down here and in many communities. And it brings this larger point I think we're hitting on, that like sometimes this idea of building social ties, we're building collective energy and collective power, that could disrupt the current power structure, and that there's people who might not want that. They might not want the current power structure disrupted in that way. So they want to continue using their social ties in the way that they're using them, and not have it build to something more. And that, just thinking about how the resources flow and different things like that. There was a example in my dissertation where I interviewed a woman in Florida, and they had a political change in how they did some of their funding of different programming. And this disability program first was funded to bring different groups and organizations together to talk about disability and disaster, and try to build the capacity of these local grassroots organizations to support members of their community who had disabilities. And then the political structure changed, and it focused more on individual. No, we're not going to fund these groups and local grassroots organizations anymore. People just need to like pull themselves up by their bootstraps and support themselves. So the organization still got money, but no longer to do workshops. They had to go and meet individually with each individual person who was disabled and try to help them write a plan for what they would do in an emergency. And she's like, we're never going to get to everybody. Like, this doesn't work. But now this is what, like, it was a complete change in philosophy and in power structures and things like that. And that's some of the fascinating stuff I think we still need to grapple with in terms of social ties and how it builds power, how it challenges power, as well as how power is maintained through some of those social ties.
I know we're getting close to time, but I think that just to sit on the gender thing. So I think, one of the interesting factors here in Milwaukee was we had a female African-American, and I think she also identifies as LGBTQ, commissioner of public health when we initiated this rapid response project. And so, just as an example, we actually did something that irritated an African-American artist, and I got a phone call from her office saying, can we talk? And she wasn't rough with me, but I knew that she really cared about equity, and she was trying to take it all the way to the ground. And I think she was forced out basically from the commissionership because she was too progressive during this process, right? And so, that, shake up in political leadership right under the mayor, really changed the tenor of what we were doing. I think that's one piece. I think another thing at sort of the microcosm level with gender. So with working with the community health workers, we had two men who were, both identified as heterosexual, and we had another man who's gay, and then we had a female community health worker. All of them strong-willed, very intense personalities overall. But I think with the two heterosexual men who I have the very strong personal bonds with, right, in terms of the work, I think they sort of struggled with a sort of assertive female leader in their midst. And so it was just, there were certain situations where, as sort of a facilitator for this work, I was, in a sense, being triangulated by the male community health workers to, in a sense, not follow some of the suggestions that were coming up from a female leader in the space. And so just trying to navigate some of the stuff around gender has been, you're trying to kind of maintain balance and process, kind of procedural equity in this, but there's a lot to contend with just around the gender piece.
Thank you. What's coming to mind here is there's a paper title, Conflict in Consensus, these underlying conflicts and consensus situations. As Zeno's mentioned, it is time. It is whatever 29. If some people would like to continue, we can continue. Otherwise, I assume you all have other things to do today. The process now is we will get you a transcript and a transcript within a couple of days to review before we publish it. So you can correct anything or tell us if there's anything you would like to have left out if you've talked about something you would not want to have in public. We will also work on writing up a kind of a summary of the conversation. And if anyone would like to participate in that, we would be more than grateful. We're still working on the summary from the last roundtable a couple of months ago, because things are busy. But there's a lot of interesting material in here. So if anyone would like to help with taking a stab at that, we would love it. And I think that's about it. If you have topics to propose, obviously, if you would like to reconvene another conversation with similar group or similar topic, please let us know. We're happy to facilitate that. We are trying to run roundtables right now about every 3 months with differing topics, bringing different people together. If you would like to have us organize or help organize one on a topic near and dear to you or on this topic, please let us know and work with us on that. Anything else, Jasmine, that I need to bring up, that we need to bring up?
No, I think that's it. Thank you.
I'm going to
Susan.
just say, live long and prosper, everybody.
Yep.
Thanks very much,
Yeah.
Susanna, Jasmine. I thought it was very interesting. And again, sorry I had to be late. Thank you.
And I want to talk to you, Louise.
Okay,
We have stuff to talk about.
great.
Wildfire, California, all
Absolutely.
this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. And it was great to
Very
meet you.
much. Delightful
Thank
to
you,
meet
Michelle.
everybody.
Thank you,
Yeah,
everyone.
thank you, Heather. Have a good weekend.
You.
Shalat.
Have a
Enjoy
good
your
weekend.
evening.
Yeah, thank you. Goodbye.